Welcome, classic rock fans, to an episode of Classic Album Review, where classic albums are excavated and explored. And today we're looking at the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Many people view this as one of the most important albums of the 20th century, as the Beatles edge away from those frenzied masses and take refuge behind their own alter ego mythology. The Edwardian marching band that gives us glimpses into childhood, a lurid Victoriana, kitchen sink melodrama, all through the obscuring lens of psychotropic substances. Sgt. Pepper very much changed the rules of what a pop record could and should be. They invented and reinvented musical form for this album, bringing together new hybrids, experimented with musical modulations usually only found in classical music. There's multi-voiced narratives, polyphony and reportage. There's no doubt this is an ambitious work. This album represents a plethora of musical styles that come together, no pun intended, to encapsulate a kind of kaleidoscopic tapestry of sound. It represented innovations in music, songwriting and graphic art, and helped bridge that divide between popular music and legitimate art. In fact, to quote Pitchfork, hailed on its release as proof that popular music could be as rich an artistic pursuit as more high-minded media such as jazz and classical, the record's reputation and sense of ambition ushered in the album era. The band, jaded with live performance, their last gig, I think it was Candlestick Park 66, decided to become a studio band, and more interestingly, they wanted to produce a themed album. The first idea was to produce an album of songs based on their childhood in Liverpool. Of course, we get Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, two songs that form the first double A-side from this album. A double A-side that George Martin deeply regrets. He always says it was the biggest mistake of his life not to put those songs on Pepper. But they soon abandoned that theme of a Liverpool-themed album that explores their childhood. But nevertheless, childhood is still explored on this album. The next idea was the idea of a fictional band. This is only explored in part on the album as well, which is why many consider this to be kind of a half concept album or loose concept album. But nevertheless, through that medium of the Sgt. Pepper Edwardian band, they do get to explore ideas such as produce something with a satirical bent on popular entertainment, curiosity and nostalgia with the past. However, despite the thematic ambitions of this record, not everybody was on board. Apparently the New York Times said of this album, like an over-attended child, Sgt. Pepper is spoiled. It reeks of horns and harps, harmonica, quartets, assorted animal noises and a 91-piece orchestra. The Sgt. Pepper theme is brassy and vaudevillian. The first songs written and recorded during the Pepper sessions were, as I've said, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane and When I'm 64. McCartney very much seizes the creative reins at this juncture in the Beatles' career, as we seem to lose Lennon, I think, after the Revolver album, and Harrison, I think, is just frustrated at being reined in all the time. But nevertheless, Steve Turner points out in his excellent book that Sgt. Pepper was actually the brainchild of Paul McCartney, who conceived of an album as a show by an Edwardian brass band, transported through time to the psychedelic age. And I certainly didn't mean to say that to undermine the contribution made by the other Beatles or the brilliant people they had working around them at the time. And there are some that suggest this is a concept album. I prefer to think of it as I've said, a loose concept or half concept album. Lennon later on in an interview said he wasn't aware of any concept at all when they were writing the songs. Brian Wilson raised the bar. I think George Martin said without Pet Sounds there wouldn't have been Sgt. Pepper. But there's another album that very rarely gets mentioned, but is equally as important, I think, to influence the Beatles or McCartney's mindset at this time. That was Frank Zappa and the Mothers' Freak Out. In fact, according to Philip Norman, during the Sgt. Pepper recording sessions, McCartney repeatedly stated, "This is our freak out." You've got to remember McCartney was living in London at the time. He was influenced by a lot of what was going on, the counterculture and those avant-garde movements in art, and all this was brought to bear on the Sgt. Pepper project. We get that wonderful iconic image of the band in military tunics. And let's not forget that the wearing of military-style tunics was very much in vogue in the mid to late 60s, and this band, this Sgt. Pepper marching band, allowed the Beatles to become subservient to their alter egos. Of course, we get the title track, and the title track very much feeds into that marching band concept, which segues into With a Little Help from My Friends. They wanted to write something for Ringo, something he could sing, so nothing too rangy, something that had a childlike vibe to it. Interestingly, Lennon hurt his finger about this time. Either this or the title track was christened Badfinger Blues. Of course, the Beatles would later pluck a band out of obscurity called the Ivies and change their name to Badfinger. I personally think the Ivies is a better name. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite is based on a Victorian poster that Lennon bought in Sevenoaks, Kent, where they were filming the Strawberry Fields premiere film. It's an interesting delving into the past, this Victoriana with its sampling and chopped up pieces of circus organ music. It's a very early example of sampling in that respect. And I'm sure, as you all know, the words on the actual poster were incorporated to form the lyrics of the song. It all creates this very eerie psychedelic swirl, very much in keeping with 1967. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, apparently a song that was inspired by a picture by Julian Lennon. Well, that's the official narrative. Anyway, unfortunately, the BBC did not buy the official narrative, and this song was subsequently banned. Nevertheless, it has this very childlike exploration to which fits into that theme of childhood explored on this album. And John's voice is slightly speeded up. The Beatles' voices are slightly speeded up to make them sound younger. You get this swirling phantasmagoria of sound on this record. I love the musical box opening played by McCartney, by the way, that gives it that otherworldly quality and that falling chromatic scale, which lends the piece a mood of dreamlike disorientation. As I said, John's voice is speeded up. It makes him sound very childlike in this. So listening to this song with Lennon, we're kind of subconsciously stepping back in time. Getting Better was inspired by a beautiful spring day. McCartney's bludgeoning optimism is somewhat blunted by Lennon's interjection, "It couldn't get no worse." Fixing a Hole was said to have been some opaque drug references. They weren't at all. I think McCartney was talking about renovating a house, renovating his life. The house becomes a kind of an analogy for that. The song deals with McCartney's own desire to let his mind wander freely and to express his creativity without the burden of self-conscious insecurities. It was the 60s after all. Good Morning has an indolence to it. It's about the routine laziness and complacency of our days, really mapped out in meal times and banal TV. And apparently the song was actually inspired by a Kellogg's Cornflakes advert. Lovely Rita is quite a cheeky number, really, which I don't think you could get away with writing these days, dedicated to a traffic warden that gave McCartney a ticket. Many consider this to be a kind of anti-authority satire. And McCartney later said that I was thinking it should be a hate song, but then I thought it would be better to love her. She's Living Home is a wonderful bit of kitchen sink melodrama based on the sort of TV docu-soaps that were very popular in the 60s. It was actually based on a real character that McCartney had read about in a newspaper. The young girl, runaway girl, was Melanie Coe. But what makes this interesting is the use of polyphony, this multi-voiced narrative. And we get the opinion of the girl, the parents, and McCartney sort of presiding over the whole thing like this big Cheshire cat who serves as the narrator. And the song employs certain folk modalities like the Aeolian folk mode, very popular in sea shanties and lots of classical songs that McCartney, probably brought up in Liverpool by the Docks, would have certainly been aware of. This lends a kind of melancholic quality to the music, irrespective of the subject matter. When I'm 64 is a song written by McCartney dedicated to his father, and it borrows from the musical style of George or Formby. It invokes many textures that a lot of us Brits would associate with the illustrator of those seaside postcards, Donald McGill. The arrangement includes chimes, clarinet, piano, and displays McCartney's love of vaudeville. It's effectively kind of a music hall pastiche. With and Without You is a fascinating one, and many see it as the origins of Western bands exploring the textures of world music in an authentic way. Now, the sitar had already been used by the Kinks, had already been used by the Rolling Stones, of course. But in those cases, the sitar was lent to these songs to give it an Eastern flavour. This is a full-on representation, a full-on, many would say, appropriation of a different form of music associated with a culture. The title of the song was actually inspired by a quote from a book called Karma and Rebirth by C. Humphreys, and the quote was, "Life goes on within you and without you," and it skillfully uses a phonetic blend of Indian instrumentation and vocal styles as well. For many, The Summer of Love, it was very much a hybrid of different musical styles. In fact, one critic said of this record that Sgt. Pepper's use of diametrically opposed aesthetic ideals, namely of classical and psychedelia, achieves a new sonic classical synthesis of the two forms. And it's this level of experimentation that ultimately sees this album being deemed as progressive. Day in Life is perhaps arguably the standout moment on this record, as Lennon, of course, magpied news articles from the Daily Mail. It was actually the blending of two songs, a song that McCartney had written and one that Lennon was writing as well, and the skill is the interweaving of these numbers. The Trippy bridge section was written by McCartney as well, and I love Ringo's drumming on this, the way his drumming punctuates a song rather than drives the beat of it, and the whole thing rises to this crescendo where the meaning of life is contained in that final chord that seems to echo on forever. Sgt. Pepper was one of the first albums to have a gatefold sleeve, to have a decorated inner bag, to have lyrics printed on the outside sleeve, and the first to come with a free gift. Pop artist Peter Blake, of course, created Jan Howarth as well, designed this wonderful cover from an ink drawing that was presented to him from McCartney. And one thing worth noting is the medals that Lennon is wearing actually belonged to Pete Best's grandfather. Many believe this is one of the very early concept albums, certainly an art rock album that spurs on the movement that would later be called progressive rock. I think it was Bill Bruford that said progressive rock wouldn't exist without the Beatles. It certainly marks the beginning of what is known as the album era. From the dreamlike haze of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a sawduster being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, to the cacophony of sound effects we get with Good Morning, Good Morning, this album is steeped in innovation. Whether recording from the inside of a brass instrument or plugging their own instruments straight into the soundboard rather than through mics, almost everything done on Sgt. Pepper tends to be a kind of a new way of thinking, a new way of forward thinking. From the iconic sleeve to the totemic ending of Day in the Life, there are a few moments in popular music history where you can say a line in the sand was drawn, but nothing was quite the same afterwards. Sgt. Pepper is one of those moments. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this review. I've certainly enjoyed revisiting this classic album. If you've watched to this point without switching off, I want to thank you for doing that, and urge you, if you haven't already done so, to click like, subscribe, and do check that notification bell. So I shall just leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, hope you're staying safe, well, but more importantly that you keep listening.